Okay, here I am in Bridport, down in Dorset, on the lovely Dorset coast. Joe Diomede, tell them I'm Brun, and I'm sitting here with Jonny Gordon Farley, who works for a nonprofit called Stir to Action. Supports local economies here in here in Dorset, but in definitely in a wider scope as well. And I'll let Jonny explain that more. So, Jonny, Stir to Action. What is Stir to Action all about, and how did it get started? And thanks for being here.
Cool. So Stir to Action started in 2011. And that started as a website, stirtoaction.com, and it was compiling lots of stories from around different social movements and different kind of local economic sectors about things going on in what you kind of generally describe as the alternative economy. We crowdfunded in 2012 and raised just over £5,000. Published a book that was online selected content, so articles, interviews, and then we commissioned 11 original pieces of art to go with that. That was successful, so 4 months later we then launched a quarterly print magazine. We just printed the 20th issue, so that launched spring 2013. So 20 issues in now. We've just published an issue on power, we've published issues on community wealth building, the cult of innovation, and a whole stuff around kind of challenging new economic ideas, both challenging people to look for new economic ways of doing stuff, but also trying to create a space where we can actually question some of these new economic approaches to see, one, if they're viable and how relevant they are to different people in different places.
Wow, okay. And so the magazine, you say your 20th issue, and what's your circulation? Is it UK based? Is it world based? Is it online as well? How has the reception of that magazine been around the world or around the UK?
Yep, so we're a print magazine, but we use a digital platform too. So we can offer digital subscriptions on iPad, smartphone, desktop computer. So more and more of the kind of European and US subscribers sign up for digitally. But we now print 3,000 copies, which might not sound like a lot, but the print market is small. The largest print magazine in Britain is the London Review of Books, and that prints about 40,000 copies. So that's a lot more, but it's still that's still the biggest publication. But yeah, we've got US readers. Our European readership is building up, and we've got a nice kind of diverse spread across the UK. So we do magazine launches every time we publish. So every quarter we go out across the UK. Just did a launch in London, we did a launch in Manchester, and then we did a launch in Totnes for our community wealth building issues. So kind of, picking up with different communities in different places around the idea of community wealth building and radical municipalism.
Right. So community wealth building and crowdfunding might be terms maybe lost to some of my people out there. Can you explain those in a little more depth?
Yep. So community wealth building it's a phrase that was coined by the Democracy Collaborative, US-based organization. And they do a lot of work, especially in kind of like disadvantaged neighborhoods. And they were working in a US city, and they found that it was one of the poorest cities in the state, but yet the local government was spending something like $3 billion a year on public services through what they call anchor institutions. So those are your hospitals, your schools, whole range of those kind of institutions. And they said, what would happen if actually we redirect this public money into worker cooperatives? They're collectively known as the Evergreen Cooperatives, and they do services around laundry for the hospitals. So these are huge public contracts. They set up a greenhouse, which is the largest indoor growing facility in the United States. It's growing 1 million heads of lettuce per year. Something like, I'm going to have to guess, maybe something like a couple of thousand tons of herbs per year as well. And that work has now come to the UK. So the kind of lead community wealth building city here is Preston. You might have heard about that. So the Economist has called it Jeremy Corbyn's ideal town. The Labour Party last weekend set up a community wealth building unit. And that's basically looking at how regional places can use public money as a way to support a social economy. Because obviously where they started from was all this money is leaking out. Multinationals are getting the contracts. So a whole bunch of work around social procurement, bunch of work around retraining procurement officers, changing the culture at councils and these large institutions, and now social enterprises and cooperatives are getting these contracts, and that's obviously growing and expanding our sector.
Wow, and it must be nice to see the fruition of some of those projects. Have you any come to mind in the UK that have worked in a positive way with the commercial well, I'm sorry, with the community.
Yeah, so I mean, Preston's still the best example. That's been supported by a think tank called CLES, which stands for the Centre for Local Economic Strategies. They're based in Manchester, but they're working with 10 cities across the UK. So if people want to find out more, then cles.org.uk. But yeah, in terms of building up the worker co-ops there, you've also got the pension funds. So the council there are leading on getting pension funds used for social and cooperative businesses. That's a big part of it. And also the network of anchor institutions are really interesting. So this is the constabulary, i.e. the police force. It's higher educational colleges as well as your hospitals and your schools. So in terms of the network building and getting that kind of consciousness around how do we rebuild local economies, how do we retain wealth, what they call sticky capital, and how does that benefit local places? And yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see what a potentially future Labour government might be able to do. The New Economics Foundation have just been commissioned by the Co-op and Labour Party to do a report on co-ops and community wealth building. And the idea behind that is that that will inform the now shadow cabinet and potentially a future government about how they can support cooperatives. Another big bit here, to take it towards the kind of national conversation is there's also quite a lot of movement around moving beyond state ownership and multi-stakeholder cooperatives, which are cooperative structures that incorporate many different stakeholders, which might be suppliers, they might be consumers, they might be investors, they might be user members and so on, into an organization. The government are now looking at that as alternatives, say, for the ownership of our train companies. So, for instance, what would it look like if we had rail franchises that had investors as members, that had rail workers as members, and had customers as members? And the idea here is that, you're democratizing access to decision making, to the rights of profit, and you're creating something which kind of, is by definition creating consensus among many different members, however difficult that might be. And, multi-stakeholder models have been tested and tried, and they're successful, but everybody has to think about the whole organization, not just about their single stakeholder group. So yeah, the big conversation is how can the challenges around state ownership, about centralized control, which we know don't work very well, how can different cooperative structures come along and offer something different, but still having the kind of democratic accountability that you get with co-ops?
Right. So in the way forward in this is almost a step back in time for when we had communities and communities work for communities and we had smaller economies, which seem to work better than the model we have now working in the Western world, at least. Yeah. And crowdfunding, just quickly before we sign off, just because I know that could affect people on a personal level trying to raise money. So can you just quickly explain what a crowdfunding is? I know you do workshops on that. So what does crowdfunding mean?
Yeah, so crowdfunding is raising financial capital from your crowd. That crowd depends on who you are and where you are. Sometimes that's an international crowd. Sometimes it can depend on your product or your service. If it's something which is relevant to a very small community of people in a particular area, that might be your crowd. But if you're publishing, say, a book, you could have an international audience. So for our first crowdfunding campaign, we published the book I mentioned, and we had pledge funders from 13 different countries. When we do workshop programs, sometimes they're tied to a locality, and often we get more support from there, or if it's tied around a sector, which might be the social economy or co-ops or, tech for good, or whatever it might be. Sometimes you can leverage funding from those different kind of like specific sectors. We also do work around what we call the funding mix, around collaborative finance. So crowdfunding by itself, is not going to change the world, but when it's used alongside other forms of finance, we found that crowdfunding can be a kind of validation process. So, for example, you want to go to the bank for £15,000 and they say, where's the evidence that you have a viable business? How can you show demand? Doing a small crowdfunding campaign to raise maybe £5,000 is a really good step. Then you go back to the bank, you say, listen, we've gone to our crowd, we have 150 future customers, plus they've put capital in now as a kind of donation or as a reward. And And we've looked at projects where somebody's crowdfunded, they've had that match funded by the local government. So there's about 20 different councils, maybe more in the UK, which are match funding. So up to a certain cap, say £5,000 or £10,000, a local council will match, depending on eligibility, a particular project. So you might be working with young people around the food system. So you might have set up a community supported agriculture project, and you want to work particularly with young people. A local authority might have that as part of their priorities, and they might fund the work with those young people as part of a match fund. And beyond that, you go into the bank with £30,000 because you've got a match fund plus your donation and your rewards. So the kind of beginning is that, the first thing to say is there's donations, there's rewards, there's equity, and there's community shares. So donation and rewards are the most popular forms of crowdfunding. So donation is obviously you get nothing in return. Right. Rewards, you get an in-kind gift in return, which might be related to the project. It might be an experience. Equity is obviously selling equity in the business. And then community shares are a particular form of equity. They're what we describe as patient capital. So people get both a social and a financial return. And some amazing data from the community share unit. So in 2005, was something like 5 community share offers in the UK. In 2015, more than 100 community share offers were registered. We work with the community shares company, work with someone called Dave Boyle, who's based in Brighton, has been supporting UK-based project. He supported more than 30 groups to raise £6.5 million. That's one organisation. So community shares, we've seen as a really kind of important piece of the kind of, the important way of kind of financing community initiatives. Legislation changed in 2014. There was a new piece of legislation around the Cooperative and Community Benefit Society Act. That cleaned up and tidied up a whole bunch of legislation. That's really kind of supported this development. And kind of around asset projects, community asset projects, the big movements at the moment are within pubs and within community shops. So there's now more than 300 community-owned shops. Wow. Many of those are rural, supported by the Plunkett Foundation, who are originally an Irish kind of cooperative development organisation, now based in Oxford. And there's something like 45 to 50 community pubs. And that's local people coming together to save their local pub, raising often £200,000 to £400,000, setting up a democratic society, community benefit society, and having the right to vote, one member, one vote, having rights to profit, should it make profit, but really there for the social return that they're retaining, protecting and rescuing a local asset that they will use over the next few generations.
Excellent. Wow. So that's, again, community. It's all community. It's all coming down to individual support. You support where you live. That's great. Let me just grab a magazine here. So Stir to Action has quite a nice, all the covers I see hanging around, as you can see behind me. Very beautiful magazine as well. And the Stir magazine for the new economy. And Jonny's been at the forefront of that for quite a while. Stir to Action, and everything that we heard, it's coming up in the UK and worldwide as well. So Jonny, thank you very much.
Cool. Thank you.
Okay. Joe Diomede, Telemann Brun. Till next time.